Hello and welcome. I'm Amritan Shura and you're watching Law of the Land on Sabha TV. Today we bring to you the Prohibition of Unfair Practices in Higher Educational Institutions Bill 2010, which seeks to prohibit capitation fees and imposes punishment for other violations. To discuss the issue, I have with me Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar, Vice Chancellor, O.P. Jindal Global University. The Parliamentary Standing Committee feels that either a mechanism for deciding the fee structure for various courses should be evolved, or the minimum and maximum limit for fees for different courses should be worked out so that there is complete transparency. My question to you, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar, the way this entire bill is evolving, you are providing education in the private sector. How do you see it impacting your entire goals?
Sure. I think the objective of the bill is pretty much clear to anybody, that there is a recognition that the large number of educational institutions, definitely the private sector, but also possibly in some public sector contexts, need to be regulated. And there have been a number of malpractices that are being adopted by these institutions, and there should be a legal and institutional mechanism to respond to it. And I don't think anybody would question that. The biggest challenge, not necessarily the problem, of this bill and similar such legislation is, at one level, we are recognizing in India that we have a gross enrollment ratio of approximately 20%, and we aspire to increase this gross enrollment ratio in the higher education sector up to 30%, and we aspire in the decades to come to reach the GAR of United States of America, which is 85%. This is one objective which we are trying to pursue. The second objective is, we realize that we are spending far too less in terms of percent of GDP in higher education, and we realize that the government doesn't have the money, and obviously the private sector has to play a big role in relation to higher education. Third, very importantly, and that is where the absence of coordination is reflected, the National Knowledge Commission, which we in a big way a decade back or 7 years back established, and went into an elaborate framework of the role of the private sector and how we have to expand it further. Most recently, just 3 days back, the Planning Commission had earlier constituted a committee under the chairmanship of Mr. Narayana Murthy to look at the role of the corporates in the higher education sector, which just submitted a report 3 days back. And frankly, some of the aspects of the bill is indeed in contradiction to some of the aspirations and the recommendations and the objectives pursued by the national. Well, for example, you talked about the fee structure. The Narayana Murthy Committee's report talks about the fee structure is something should be entirely determined by the private institutions which are establishing. When the private institutions have put in huge investments in relation to establishing these institutions, they should have the complete
right to decide fees.
However, the biggest problem in India is that we are constantly struggling to balance those institutions which are maintaining the highest academic standards on the one hand, and those which are not. And any law which is going to bring in all of them in one ambit will inevitably have this problem. So this bill will also have a similar problem. And the second, more fundamental problem in my view is that we have in the past tried to regulate higher education. We have the UGC, the Bar Council, the All India Council of Technical Education, the Medical Council of India. And frankly, in spite of all these regulations, in spite of all these laws, we have a situation where there has been widespread corruption, lack of transparency and accountability in the functioning of these regulatory bodies, and we have not been able to maintain the kind of standards and monitoring mechanisms these institutional mechanisms already envisage.
I get it, but the bill is pretty clear on that front. Except for capitation fee, all the other violations are non-cognizable, which essentially means will not attract police action directly. Any action will have to come via the court. Do you think that's a good enough escape route and fine for private educations who are imparting quality education?
Well, I for one strongly believe that there is education ought to be a non-profit activity. There is something anathematic about the idea of education to be a profit-making endeavor. Fundamentally because of the fact that the kind of things that are measured in terms of success or production or manufacturing is not the same as it is you can quantify in the case of educational institutions. The kind of impact in a society of educated people, these are immeasurable in the way
training of the mind
would be measured. And there is no doubt about the fact that the world's best universities in the private sector, be it Harvard, Yale, Stanford, NYU, these are all private universities but are non-profit institutions.
Yes.
So I am absolutely strongly believe the fact that it ought to be a non-profit activity. Now the question is, as far as the capitation fee is concerned, there is a much more fundamental problem. Let us be honest about it, which is, how do you even find out whether an institution is engaged in actually collecting a so-called capitation fee beyond what it should be legally entitled? It's like trying to understand, we all know that over 90% of property transactions in this country are black money based. And that's something which our parliamentarians know, everybody knows it. You go across the country, this is the situation. So a good part of that money is essentially collected as cash. And today, unfortunately, educational institutions are not collecting capitation fee in a, you can regulate capitation fee if collected through a legal way.
Yes.
You can prohibit it, and it's already prohibited.
Where the transaction
How do you prohibit an activity which is
not
so in
existing.
Some ways, some parts of the bill to me is very naive. It's like saying, oh, if something is not, you don't get a receipt for it, who's going to give you a receipt? Of course they are collecting fee across the board around the country in an illegal manner through cash, and for which there is no receipt. So the question is, there is absolutely no regulatory framework which will be able to identify and target those areas where black money transactions take place.
The Parliamentary Standing Committee is of the view that payment under the head of other charges should be included as capitation fee, and any excess amount over 10% of the tuition fee should be termed as capitation fee. Okay, we've talked enough about capitation fee and why it is required and all that, but the point you wanted to make relating to institutional framework and enabling environment.
Yeah, well, the point which I was about to make was that it's important that the bill takes into consideration the changing perspectives in relation to higher education and the role the private sector ought to play in it. As I mentioned earlier, while ensuring that private sector involvement in higher education should be non-profit, it also should be recognized that we need to take far rigorous steps in allowing institutions to be established. Whenever we come back with such provisions, punitive penal provisions, our record historically has been rather weak. We've had a number of penal legislation, not in the education sector, but also other sectors, have not been able to be enforced. And we also should understand that when many of these matters end up in court, that also complicates matters because it will take many years for a judgment to come.
Yes.
So we also should not be in some sort of an illusion that a strong law which will create an enforcement mechanism
clear all problems.